Hey everyone! So I know the last few chapters have been a little depressing. We've talked about extinction and all the different threats, mostly caused by people, to different species and ecosystems and biodiversity. This is where we finally get to start thinking about how to fix it and what we can actually do as individuals and organizations to conserve biodiversity. And so we'll start having some more optimistic themes, hopefully. So this chapter is on conserving populations and species, and it's chapter 6 in your textbook. So if you're having trouble with any of this material, I really encourage you to go back and read chapter 6 in your book. So a lot of species conservation is basically applied population biology. And populations naturally fluctuate in size. So population biology is the study of that. But more and more, we see that these fluctuations are a result of all of those threats to biodiversity that we talked about in chapter 4. So we want to know how we can measure how our activities affect wild populations of plants and animals. How can we decide what actions to take to reverse population declines? And these are all things we need to know for effective management. And effective management requires knowledge of natural history, which is the study of species characteristics. It can be things like life history, so like their pattern of growing, when they become mature. Life history describes the kind of life events of different species, and also behavior. Population biology is the study of factors and processes that affect population size and distribution. And so this can include both ecology and the genetics of populations. So historically, if you think back to like the 1800s and earlier, natural history and population biology were studied for their own sake. And much of early biology consisted of these descriptive natural history studies. People wanted to know why some species had a few offspring and some species had lots of offspring, and they described these different patterns. And there were all kinds of papers looking at things like that, like what time of year things happened in a species life cycle and all these kinds of things. Currently, that type of science is not highly valued. In fact, there is very, very little funding for studying natural history and understanding basic facts about different species. So some species have been studied really, really well, and some have not. And there's not a lot of money available to find things out about species. There is often money if that species is already endangered. But this information is very important for conservation biology and for applied population biology. And a lot of times there is funding, as I said, for very rare species that we're concerned about, but sometimes that information takes a while to accrue. Sometimes we need to study species for multiple years. And so it's much easier to conserve a species if we have that information available already before it becomes endangered. So, topics of natural history and population biology that inform conservation biology. So this is kind of a list. Environmental studies, which understand what kind of habitats a species is found in. Are there particular microhabitats or really small places that they need to survive? We need to know information about their distribution. Where is this species located? How many populations are there? How far do they move? All these kinds of information. Biotic interactions. What are the predators, prey, competitors, parasites? How might all of these affect population dynamics? Morphology. This might seem really basic, but for some species, we don't even have a great grasp on how to differentiate between one species and the next, how much variation there is in a species. We also need to know about physiology, and with climate change, this is becoming increasingly important. So, what temperatures and humidities does the species need? When does it reproduce? Demography, which includes population sizes, trends, sex ratios, all of these kinds of things. And then behavior. What is the mating system? How do they interact to breed? Do they live in groups? Do they forage in groups? What determines group dynamics? All of these kinds of questions can influence population biology. Also, genetics. And so we talked about the importance of genetic variation. So knowing how much genetic variation exists and how that genetic variation is spread among different populations. So are there certain groups that have more genetic diversity? Are there really distinctly different groups of genes in different populations? That can be very important. And then interactions with humans. How do human landscapes affect the species? Are they scared of people? Do they interact with people on a regular basis? Is there conflict with people? And so where do we get this knowledge? That's a lot of different types of questions that we might need to answer to effectively conserve a species. So where do we get this information? Two places: the literature, which is things that are already published, and then new research. So the literature includes scientific papers or scientific publications from different journals. These are some examples of some different journals. Some of them, or most of them, these are peer-reviewed, meaning that each time a paper is published, other scientists review that work. And basically they go through the methods and the data and the conclusions and make sure that they think that this study is robust and that they've done everything they could to make the results as reliable as possible. Most scientists get asked to review papers on a regular basis. We don't get paid to do that. It's all volunteer. And so right now in my email box, I have 2 requests to review papers. One is about the Endangered Species Act, which we'll get to later in this chapter. And one is about amphibian ecology and freshwater ecosystems. So this is a regular part of what scientists do on a regular basis, and that's review other people's work. There's also unpublished literature. There's government documents and reports. So you can see this one comes from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There are other reports from organizations like the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and then some nonprofits also produce reports on species. Sometimes this is called the gray literature. So the published, peer-reviewed scientific research is often called the white literature, and this is the gray literature. So there's the literature, and if you want to conserve a species, usually the first place you go is you get all the papers and you read all of them and summarize them to make sure you know everything you need to know. The next thing you need to do if there are big gaps is research, i.e. field work. So if an ecologist tells you they're going out in the field, they don't literally mean they're going to a field, though they could be. They could be going to a forest or a pond or out on the ocean. Fieldwork just means you're going away from your office, away from the laboratory to collect data. And only a small fraction of our species have been studied to a great extent. And a lot of times, if we're missing a lot of information, we'll try to extrapolate from related species. And this is sometimes what we do when we don't have any other choice, like there's not enough time to do the research we need, or there's not enough money. Sometimes we'll extrapolate from related species. But there are examples where this has led us astray and not turned out very well. So an example is this is a black-footed ferret, which is a highly endangered species. A friend of mine actually helped bring them back from extinction. They had gotten down to, I believe it was like 5 or 6 individuals, and they now have some viable populations. But they thought we could learn about black-footed ferrets by studying the European polecat, which is relatively closely related, very similar species. And so they tried using vaccines that had been developed for European polecats. Unfortunately, they tried that and ended up killing individuals of black-footed ferrets, which is, of course, not something we want for an endangered species. So sometimes we can extrapolate from related species, but it doesn't always work well. So it helps to have specific information on a specific species.